Hello, hello. It's me and the dog, Mr. Crumbs. He's being a little lazy today because mommy's not home and mommy's the favorite. I'm okay too, but only when I have food. He's spoiled. As a, didn't mean to make you do that. As a former jailer, I do think that I offer perspectives that don't always exist in current spheres. I worked in a jail for 7 years, and I like talking about very difficult subjects. The less I know about it, the more I like talking about it, because in modern day politics, everybody just talks about shit they don't fucking know. And we like to be wrong about a lot of things, but pretend like we're right. So allow me to say my inaccuracies, because everybody else is allowed to be wrong, but if you're wrong and you don't admit it, then you become famous, but if you admit it, nobody pays attention to you, because integrity is a thing of the past. So we're going to talk about race. What are my thoughts on it? What are my thoughts on racism and how the media looks at it? And how my views on conflict make me look at it. No, stop advertising your stupid bullshit. So, when I first started there, I was 21. I was fairly naive. I knew that some people were racist, but like for the most part, it was kind of just like a minor thing. And I was kind of surprised by just how many people were racist in jails and prisons. If you think that racism is an overblown topic, go to a fucking jail. Everybody's fucking racist in jail, and they get even worse in prison. From what you can tell from media, a lot of that's not really necessarily untrue, but it gets uglier. Jails weren't that bad. My jail was pretty good, so this didn't come up too often. But as a jailer, you can't do a job like that long enough, for a long enough period of time, without the issue of race coming up. Everybody had to watch the same television, and a black guy would occasionally come up and ask for like a TV channel change, like basketball, BET, something stereotypical, or something else that just people did not appreciate. And sometimes minor things like that would just devolve into these mass arguments. And everybody kind of just goes back to whatever race they are, and they just kind of support whoever's a part of their race, and it becomes very tribal very quickly if you don't control it. And you can't really do your job without occasionally being accused of racism. It's very common for a black dude to come up to you and say, "Hey, you're doing this because I'm black," and it's also common for a white dude to come up to you and say, you only enforce rules on me because I'm white, and you're just going to let the black people do whatever you want because you're scared to be called racist." And it's one of those situations to where you can very easily be put in a situation where nobody's going to be happy with what you do. And it makes it very difficult to tell the difference between real racism and perceived racism. Because, in my opinion, when race is highlighted so much, everything becomes racist. Everything becomes an issue of race. And it's seldomly the perspective of the person that you're talking to. And dealing with that is very difficult, especially if you're an officer, especially if you're a white officer. If you're a black officer, it can be difficult for different reasons. You might get called an Uncle Tom. Black people might be a little bit harder on you if you're a black officer, or they might be easier on you because they just think that they have something in common with you, even if they've lived completely different lives. white people can be especially hard on you if you're a black officer. So it kind of just gets pretty messy. From what I can tell, and from what I think that people will always have some sense of tribalism, and people will always try to look for commonalities they have with other people to separate themselves from people that they view themselves different as. And finding similarities between you and somebody different from you is something that is a very hard skill and something that many people are unwilling to do. I think that gangs in these environments make this worse. A lot of times racism is very much reinforced with rules for gangs. And I think that an environment where things are supposed to be strict and regimented and everything is like, because if you're an inmate, it is very much and very easily a you versus the officer situation. I think that in that pursuit of vision, you start looking at things as an us versus them. And once you get into that point of view, it's easier and easier to find the them. And it's easier to define who is us and who is them. And that kind of just reinforces some racist tendencies. I think that a lot of times it's just a lazy argument that some people devolve into because they don't know how to express their actual frustrations. This goes for both black and white people. Mexicans is a little bit of a different story because a lot of times they don't speak English. A lot of times they're typically scared of you. I have been told it's because Mexican police can be very different, and a lot of them don't trust their governments, and they might view our government the same way. I'm a little bit ignorant on that, to be honest with you, but I noticed that they're a lot more cooperative and a lot more. The games that they play are a little bit different. It's a lot of, I don't speak English whenever you're telling me something I don't want to listen to. And that's kind of like the worst you'll really encounter. But with black and white inmates, it was different because it's a battle of perceptions. And so when you're doing that job, you have to learn how to traverse very delicate situations that you might not be comfortable traversing. Sometimes this is made worse when it is ignored. Sometimes it's best to ignore it. And sometimes you can't really guess how people are going to respond. The best thing that I can say is that any form of silencing communication can only make it worse, because you have to be able to understand what a person is thinking, what a person is feeling, to be able to actually do a job like that, but also just to do normal life. And the reason why I wrote my book, Life is Hard When You Are Stupid, is because I viewed jail as kind of a microcosm for how the world worked. And I think that a lot of the conflict resolution, the skills that I've learned there, can be applied to day-to-day life. And I think that a lot of it can be very relevant. A bad decision and a bad rule is very similar to a bad law or a bad policy at your job. Somebody who's an authoritative figure in a position of authority telling you to do things and them not understanding how to do that in an effective way affects work environments pretty badly. It affects how law enforcement interacts with the typical public. It affects how politicians interact with the typical public. And the different levels of authority and the different levels of positions, the different layers between you and that person of authority and how that affects them, the decision making and how being ignorant in that decision making can negatively impact people. A lot of things like that. I very quickly had to learn how to interact with black inmates, because for somebody who is young and ignorant, it was very hard for me to understand that point of view. And a lot of times it was very easy for me to dismiss a lot of their complaints as them just pulling the race card to avoid any personal responsibility. Granted, there are some inmates that do that. One of them in particular was very manipulative, who he documented every interaction he had with everybody and tried his best to get a lawsuit out of anything, and almost got me sued because he had been moved to a cell, and I either didn't know, I forgot that he was moved in there, one of the two, and he was asleep, and I was giving out sandwiches, and I yelled chow call, and I walked past his cell, and I guess it just doesn't register in my brain, and he tried to accuse me of not feeding him because I was racist. And even him, I talked to him about it, and we kind of came to some sort of a resolution, you know. The worst thing I could have done in that situation, and in any other situation where I was accused of being racist, is to just be immediately dismissive. Because if even somebody who's trying to get a lawsuit out of me I can talk to and I can understand their point of view. Because I told him, he told me, he said, like, I think that you're just like outright trying to refuse to feed me. And I told him, I said, to be honest with you, dude, you were asleep, and it didn't even register in my brain. I was just trying to get it done. And I just didn't do a good enough job making sure that everybody was fed. And I told him, I said, like, and because that had happened to me before, I even kept the food up here just in case. And the next shift didn't want to give it to you because they didn't want to believe you. And I think that and other black inmates in the pod getting fed kind of made him realize, like, okay, maybe you just didn't do your job correctly, and maybe you just didn't pay attention. Maybe he was just saying that to get me out of his face. I don't know. But a lot of times when I was being called racist, it was a black inmate that was telling me and trying to tell me that he thinks I'm being unfair, and the only reason that he can see why I'm being unfair to him is because of his skin color, because that is the only thing that he sees different. And a lot of times, people who are dismissive of that and who do not know how to talk in situations like that make it worse. Sometimes there might actually be some underlying racism. I don't know. I like to think that I'm not racist. I really don't give a shit about the topic, and I think me and a lot of other white people in similar position as me want to ignore this, and we want to pretend like it's not a thing. We want to try to avoid it and claim neutrality, or we just get really uncomfortable about it and we're worried that we're going to be called racist for having the wrong opinion. I'm not too sure why, to be honest. And I think that part of the problem is that a lot of the analysis in these situations doesn't take into account how white people look at it, because a lot of it is very one-sided. You're either somebody who watches Fox News and you think that everybody is just a thug, or black people just want to try to get reparations for everything and blah, 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 and that it's people committing crimes and then using race as an excuse and blaming institutional racism for every single decision they've ever made. Or you're somebody who's liberal and you try not to speak and you try to only listen to one side of the conversation without fully understanding why some people are racist. Because some people, I've met people in Georgia who have never met a black person, or haven't met a black person until like mid to late teens. I've met people who have opinions, but who have never spoken to a black person. I've met people who only get racist and get more racist, rather. Maybe there's like some underlying opinions that they haven't really acknowledged. And then once they get accused of being racist, they kind of double down. And there's almost like a, if you're gonna call me racist, I'll show you racist kind of mentality. Uh, and I think the conversation gets muddied because it's just kind of everybody sticking to their own perspectives and not really thinking about it. Because there have been times where I told a guy to do a thing that I didn't really notice when other people did it, and he called me on. He says, like, I feel like you're just doing this because I'm black. I'm like, what do you mean? And he pointed out like other people that were doing it, and I was like, hey, that's a pretty fair point. I'm not gonna lock you down. Just I'm trying to get on top of it. Just make your bed or whatever. And I'm sorry if you feel that way. And then like I feel like there's like that underlying hostility, like when conversations like that come up, like sometimes they expect you to be hostile back to them, or like white people expect black people to be hostile to them, and so like they start the conversation with hostility, especially in an environment like that where hostility can easily come up from a lot of situations. And I think that prevents people from being able to move forward and learn. I think that it's just an awkward position because you're trying to focus on other things, and maybe avoiding it is easier for the moment, or maybe being a public figure, you're not really allowed to give public opinions. Like, I didn't make YouTube videos when I worked there because I'm a public figure and I can't give my opinions. All of my opinions are reflected on the sheriff. So we have this like sanitized neutrality view where we're trying to avoid uncomfortable topics and uncomfortable opinions. And I think that's what kind of society does in a larger sense, especially with race, so that the conversations that you have are all sanitized and they're safe for media consumption. They're safe for people to not have their feelings hurt. They don't really challenge people. And so when people do try to have a conversation where they're challenging you, and where there might be something to learn, or there might be some sort of a disagreement that can be worked out, it's just all of these complaints and things that kind of come up out of nowhere. And I think that's what makes it easy to dismiss it if you're younger and white and you haven't really had to hear about it that much, or even if you're older and white, or just somebody who's tried to avoid the topic for so long that when people bring it up, it just seems like it's preaching, or it seems like people trying to force you to think in a particular way, and you may not feel like you've done anything wrong, but you feel like you're being accused of doing something wrong. And so people either avoid it, they argue back, they double down, and it turns into a mess. And then we overanalyze the situation to where half of the people are in denial about the problem of race, and the other half of the people, the ones that are actually offering perspective, only really get to offer their perspective. I had, on my last day, there was an inmate that had called me racist. The previous day. So my last 2 days, somebody called me racist, and the next day I had a conversation with him about it. He wanted to help clean. He wanted to, because I only had one guy that was supposed to clean the entire pod. He's the only one approved, and he had been asking me if this other guy could help him clean. What I didn't know was the other guy wanted that day off, and this guy was going to be the next person to offer to help. But he came up to me. Now, what he doesn't understand, what a lot of people don't understand, is, especially if you're in a position like that, you kind of just default say no to things until you have good reason to say yes. It's kind of the same thing for maybe being a nanny, or anywhere where like you're completely responsible for everything that could happen. So I told him no, because he asked me, and what I wanted to explain to him was I want my worker to tell me who he wants to help him, because I knew my worker wasn't going to pick somebody that was just going to fool around. And I try to explain that to him, and at first he called me racist. He says, "You're just saying no to me because I'm a tall dude with a tall black dude with tattoos, and you just think less of me because of that." But the other guy that was helping was also a tall black dude with tattoos, so it was kind of just confusing and frustrating. But I was like, whatever. He's just another guy calling me racist. And I said, well, I want to hear it from the other guy. I don't want you to tell me because everybody's going to ask me to help clean because everybody wants to be out of their cells. But if he's saying that you're going to help, and if I can verify that it's not going to be a problem, then I don't mind. And once I kind of explained that to him, he goes, oh, okay, well, ask him. So I asked him, he said, yeah, he's going to help me tonight. I said, all right, cool. I said, and then I went up to the other guy, I said, yeah, you can help out tonight. The next night, he found out that it was my last day, so he wanted to talk to me because he, at first, was pretty hostile. And then after that whole debacle, when I basically explained it to him, he like chilled out a little bit. So then we talked, and you know, and he was asking me why I was leaving the jail, and he was telling me about how he was leaving soon, and I told him, I said, you know, one of the problems that kind of comes up sometimes when you're in a job where you're constantly having to question people's intentions, when you're constantly wondering why people are saying things. I told him, I said, inmates are sometimes nice to me to get something out of me. I said, deputies are sometimes nice to me to get something out of me, or because they care so much about their image that they just have this dishonest way of talking to you because it's so political. And I told him, I said, like, I kind of am conditioned as a person to not really trust who I talk to, and I'm kind of conditioned to question everything and everybody's intentions to the point to where it's exhaustive, and it has affected my personal life. And I told him, I said, like, to some weird extent, in from a position of authority, I'm like institutionalized in that kind of way, to where, you know, and I'm sure this is common for a lot of people who are prior law enforcement or jails or military, you know, not letting people walk behind you, not being able to sit at a restaurant without being able to see the exits, or not being able to go into a building without knowing where the exits are, or wanting to know who's in the room before you walk around. Is anybody being shady? Why are they being shady? All sorts of weird shit like that, because you can't just be a normal person. And like, being confrontational for your job makes you a confrontational person, so it made it to where it was hard for me to have friendships, relationships with my family, relationships with women, because it's you just argue, and you have to forget that you're not in charge, you're not the authoritative figure, and regardless of how right you are, you can't just argue your way through something. You have to talk about it. You know, you have to talk about it. You have to look at things from their point of view. You have to consider that you might be wrong a little bit. All sorts of things like that kind of just affect your personal life a little bit. And he said he understood. He said, I never really thought about officers being institutionalized, but it kind of makes sense when you explain it. And he apologized to me for calling me racist when I brought it up in that conversation. He says, I didn't really mean it. I was just pissed off. And I told him, I said, to be honest with you, I don't really blame you, because I don't really, and officers don't really explain why we do things, and all you can see is you feel like you're being treated unfairly, and that's the only reason that you can really think of. And I think that your brain jumps to you saying that, but what you're trying to say is, I'm being treated unfairly and I don't know why. And this is the reason why. I think it could be an issue of race, I don't know. But it's just a compulsion that where you kind of just say it, because I think that you're a little bit conditioned to think that way. Yeah, I could be wrong about that, but I think there is some conditioning to think in that way. And then we talked about it, and he was talking about, he said, well, you know, I'm trying to be better because I'm going to be out of jail soon, and I'm trying to work on myself. And I told him, I said, the biggest thing that you really got to remember is, I said, especially if you're going to be done with everything, is that this place and places like this are not the end-all be-all, and you have to remember that you can't act the same way in two different environments. And I told him, like I said, you've been out of high school how many years? If you hang out with a bunch of high schoolers, you're going to act like a little bit of a teenage douchebag. Same thing with here. Like, you hang out with a bunch of inmates, and where a lot of them are liars and cheats and can be pretty negative influences, that's what you're going to be like. Uh, and he kind of understood. He understood that. And we had a very, very long conversation. I told him about my book that I was publishing, and he said that he was very impressed and that he was sad that I was leaving, because he felt like, for once, he felt like there wasn't too many people that worked there, in any jail for that matter, that were willing to have a conversation with him like that. And that's another problem with race, is that a lot of times it's not just the race, but it's authority versus non-authority. And I think that the interactions, the way that we interact with authority is so heavy on just listening to authority that too often are we expected to shut up and listen and to have our feelings ignored. And what ends up happening is, if people don't understand why things are happening, and if you're unwilling to explain it to them, whatever interpretation they have of the situation is going to be their reality. And that happens a lot with race, I think. I think that it's hard to tell what's actually racist and what's not actually racist, because we're unwilling to explain ourselves, and we're unwilling to hold ourselves accountable, and we're unwilling to evaluate why we're doing things. We just do things and don't question it. We move on, because society tries to do so many things that there isn't really much time for a careful analysis. And when there is time for careful analysis, it's almost always for political purposes. So it's pretty useless anyway. You already know the conclusions that somebody's going to come to based on whatever political party they have, based on whatever their political opinions they have. And it's regardless of whatever information is presented. And so this conversation becomes pretty muddied, because you have a group of people who feel as though they are unheard, a group of people that don't want to listen, and a group of people who don't understand it. And those three groups aren't mutually exclusive from each other. And I think that there needs to be a lot more uncomfortable conversations. I think that more people need to be willing to have this conversation, if for nothing else, to just be able to open that understanding. Because, and this is something that every experienced person in high stressful situations, or law enforcement, or military, or anybody who has to negotiate for hostages or anything like that, like they will tell you, like I've had to talk to people onto a suicide watch where you get your clothes taken away and you're put in a turtle suit. That's not an easy thing to convince somebody to do. The number one thing that everybody wants is to feel like they're being listened to, even if you don't agree with them. Shut up, listen, and then explain your point of view from using their perspective to help both of you understand each other a little bit better. And then it becomes a little bit more clear on who's right and who's wrong. There are always going to be bad faith actors in this on every side. And you can't let those people dictate how your conversations with people who disagree with you go. And I think that a strong rejection of tribalism is very important in these situations, because I think the us versus them mentality just makes it easier to not listen. And so, just like how white people have a hard time communicating their thoughts and feelings about it, and some of them double down and become more racist in these conversations, and some of them just are in denial about it, and most of them just kind of avoid it altogether. I think the messages from the black community can get a little bit muddled too. I think that a lot of it is from a singular perspective. I think a lot of it, I've been watching a lot of, I think his channel name is FD Signifier. I think a lot of that, and some of the things that he says, especially when he brings up the white perspective, like I look at it and I'm like, I don't think so. I don't know. Man. I mean, maybe for some people, but not for me. I don't really think that applies to me. It's not doesn't. It's just like sometimes when like Black Lives Matters, when they were a thing, or just black activists when they try to talk about the white perspective, they talk about it from their understanding of the white perspective from the black perspective, and so that kind of gets a little bit muddied. Like somebody said, like I think one of the things that he said was, it was something like white people are frustrated because we're supposed to have this white privilege, but we're not getting anywhere in society. And yeah, some people probably think that. But to be honest with you, there's some people that just, and I guess you can call this white privilege, but like some people just had the luxury to not even fucking think about that. You know, most people just look at bills, not making enough money, and get pissed off about it. And for some people, that's as far as it goes. And for me, it was a little bit jarring how he came. Like there was one video where he came to that conclusion. I can't remember what it was about. I don't remember if it was incels or something like that. But one thing that he did say that I agree with very strongly was that part of the problem is that white people aren't really included in the conversation. And I think that's true. When black people talk about race, it's talking at white people. There's kind of like this refusal to understand the other perspective. It's trying to educate to where it feels very much like a one-sided conversation. And then on the other side, there's a completely different reverse one-sided conversation that's just objectively wrong. The thug conversation, the way that the media tries to spin a lot of things. Like there's a lot of truth in it, but there's also like not a whole lot of consideration for the message. And I think that's why a lot of people get turned off at these messages, because it's a message that is communicated from the perspective of the protesters or the activists. And protesters and activists do a lot of things well, but one thing they don't understand a lot of the time is how to make people who think differently understand their point of view. And that's because a lot of times they don't want to understand it, or they have their own weird warped interpretation of understanding of it, or it's just them wanting to get their message out so much that they're not understanding what other people are hearing. So a lot of what I said I think is probably relatively harmless. Some people might get their feelings in a tizzy. I don't know. Feel free to call me a racist. Feel free to call me I don't know, whatever else you want to fucking call me. But that's just my point of view from the conversation. And I think that there's probably more I could say, but most of it would just be kind of beating a dead horse. I don't really want to have any absolute conclusions. It's just kind of my thoughts and feelings on the matter. That's really it.